Sterling Vance stepped across the threshold of our Scottsdale home smiling, his face deeply bronzed from a month under the relentless glare of the Greek sun. Behind him, Alana Brooks rolled a piece of heavy, gold-trimmed luxury luggage across the pristine cherry hardwood floor, her designer sandals clicking with the absolute certainty of a conqueror entering a captured territory. Sterling carried himself with the effortless, breezy posture of a monarch returning to a kingdom he assumed would always belong to him by right of survival. Then his gaze drifted upward toward the double-height living room wall, and his entire body went rigidly, impossibly still. The massive oil painting of our wedding day had completely vanished from its central place of prominence. In its stead hung an expansive, museum-grade photograph of me standing beneath the amber evening light of the Sedona desert, laughing effortlessly beside a tall, quiet man whose hand rested respectfully near mine. Directly beneath this image, mounted in a stark black frame like a terminal judgment, was a certified legal instrument bearing a single name under the line for sole primary resident, mine. Sterling was the kind of man who engineered his life around public pronouncements because he understood that audiences grant a specific type of social immunity. If there were onlookers present, he became instantly magnetic, impossibly charming, and entirely unassailable, ensuring that anyone who challenged his narrative would immediately appear volatile, emotional, or fundamentally unstable. It took me 17 years of quiet marriage to fully comprehend that specific architecture of control. Women do not typically discover the systemic erosion of their lives all at once. We learn it through the steady accumulation of microscopic humiliations that bury themselves deep within the muscle tissue, until one day, the weight becomes too heavy for the bone to carry. The evening that ultimately dismantled the foundation of our family began deceptively, with the scent of searing ribeyes, delicate string lights twinkling across the patio, and classic country ballads drifting over our manicured backyard. We had hosted dozens of these polished gatherings for our neighbors, spaces where Sterling could perform the role of the self-made construction magnate, while I managed the invisible machinery of comfort in the background. It was supposed to be a standard early summer Saturday night, filled with the predictable rhythms of suburbia. I was balancing a heavy porcelain platter of fresh corn salad from the kitchen when the sound of Sterling's laughter cut through the ambient chatter near the outdoor wet bar. It wasn't the warm, unforced laugh of a man enjoying his friends, but rather a loud, performative, theatrical projection designed to draw every pair of eyes in the yard toward his orbit. His manicured hand was draped casually around the bare shoulder of Alana Brooks, a 28-year-old independent marketing consultant he had hired for his firm 3 months prior. She possessed the kind of meticulously manufactured look that seemed to exist exclusively to be captured by a high-definition lens, complete with waist-length blonde extensions and a deep Mediterranean tan. Standing beside an ice chest overflowing with cold drinks, I watched the way her fingers brushed his linen shirt, and a cold certainty settled over me. Women always know the truth long before they find the courage to give it a name, but there is a profound difference between harboring a private suspicion and watching your husband redefine your entire existence in front of 15 neighbors holding paper plates. One of our oldest friends made a passing joke about Sterling spending more time at site inspections with his new consultant than at his own dinner table, and Sterling merely lifted his bourbon glass toward the sky with a brilliant, unbothered grin. He cleared his throat, ensuring his voice carried over the sound of the pool filters, and looked directly across the lawn. "Vivian and I are pioneering a completely different approach to our partnership these days," he announced, his tone dripping with casual condescension. "This is effectively an open marriage now, though she simply hasn't fully leaned into the freedom of it yet." The entire backyard fell into a horrific, suffocating silence. A neighbor down the terrace coughed awkwardly into his napkin, and the music filtering through the outdoor rock speakers suddenly sounded deafeningly abrasive. I remember the precise sensation that washed through my limbs in that exact microsecond. It wasn't a sudden burst of tears or a wave of hot anger, but rather a profound, sub-zero stillness. It was the feeling of walking onto an iced lake, hearing a deep fracture split beneath your boots, and realizing exactly how far the freezing dark extends beneath you. I stood completely motionless, waiting for him to deliver the punchline that would transform the statement into a tasteless joke, but the silence remained unbroken. Instead, Sterling pulled Alana a fraction of an inch closer against his flank, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his small batch bourbon, while our guests desperately studied the grain of the flagstone patio to avoid looking at my face. To understand how we arrived at that patio, you have to understand that Sterling had not always been a monster. He had always been intensely ambitious, fiercely self-interested, and somewhat vain, but true calculation only emerged after wealth inflated his ego into something unmanageable. A decade earlier, he was just another exhausted mid-level contractor, suffocating under the weight of a tanking housing market, while I worked 60 hours a week in residential design and carried the entirety of the emotional labor for our young daughter, Chloe. When his company's primary bank account was on the verge of frozen liquidation during the credit crunch, I didn't hesitate. I signed over the entirety of the inheritance my mother had left behind to keep his machinery moving. That number was exactly $70,000. It represented every hour of labor my mother had ever logged as a night shift nurse, every sacrifice she had ever made to ensure I had choices in this life, and I handed it to him without a single legal contingency because I believed a marriage was a single vessel. In those lean years, Sterling used to press his forehead against my shoulder late at night and whisper that I was the singular anchor holding his world together. It is truly remarkable how quickly powerful men can rewrite their own historical narratives once they no longer require the specific hands that pulled them out of the mud. The neighborhood gathering dissolved within 45 minutes of his announcement, our guests making rushed, transparent excuses about early mornings and forgotten obligations because no one wants to be trapped inside a domestic crime scene. I cleared the discarded paper plates and half-eaten steaks from the outdoor tables in total silence, the desert wind catching the edges of the trash bags. Inside, Sterling sat at the granite kitchen island, his thumb tracing the screen of his phone, completely unbothered, as though he had simply announced a change in the lawn care schedule, rather than detonating a 17-year life partnership in front of our social circle. If this story is resonating with you, or if you have ever had to stand your ground when someone tried to rewrite your reality, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and join our community. I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below about a time you felt completely dismissed or underestimated by someone who should have known your true value, and how you found the strength to hold your head high anyway. I set the dish towel down on the counter, my fingers trembling slightly against the stone. "You humiliated me in front of everyone we know," I said, my voice dangerously level. Sterling didn't even bother to glance up from his screen, his thumb continuing its rhythmic scrolling. "You are completely overreacting to a modern conversation, Vivienne," he replied, his tone conversational and flat. I told them the truth of where society is moving, and honestly, we should have an open arrangement. Lifelong monogamy is a completely unrealistic metric in the modern world, and people have to be allowed to evolve. I let out a short, dry laugh that caught in my throat, because the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of his vocabulary was too immense for tears. "Evolve," I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Is that the current corporate euphemism for bringing your 28-year-old employee to a family barbecue?" Sterling let out a dramatic, long-suffering sigh, the exact type of sound impatient men make when they are forced to explain elementary concepts to a child. "Look," he said, finally setting the phone face up on the island. "I didn't actively plan for this connection to develop, but Alana makes me feel entirely alive again, in a way I haven't felt in 10 years. I am 46 years old, Vivienne, and I refuse to spend the remaining chapters of my life trapped in a predictable, stagnant routine." "And what precisely do I receive from this enlightened new structural update?" I asked, leaning against the sink. "That is entirely up to your own discretion," he answered with a dismissive shrug of his shoulders. "You possess the exact same freedom to explore whatever connections you see fit." It was a statement so completely detached from the reality of our shared lives that I almost found myself admiring the towering arrogance behind it. Men like Sterling only fall in love with the concept of absolute freedom when they are entirely convinced they are the only ones with the capital, the youth, and the leverage to spend it. Upstairs, the heavy oak door to Chloe's bedroom clicked shut with a definitive, hollow sound. She had heard every single word. Sterling walked over to the built-in wine column, uncorked a bottle of expensive Cabernet, and poured himself a fresh glass without offering one to me. "I am leaving for the Mediterranean on Tuesday morning," he stated, his back turned to me. 3 weeks across the Greek islands, and then we might spend a week tracking up through the Amalfi Coast. Alana has already cleared her consulting schedule to manage the travel. I stared at the lines of his expensive linen shirt, my chest tightening. "You are actually serious?" "Yes," he said, turning around slowly, a hard, defensive irritation settling into the corners of his eyes. "You think I am supposed to quietly remain in this house, maintaining your domestic base, while you parade your mistress across international resorts?" Mistress is an incredibly archaic and dramatic word to use here, Vivienne, and frankly, this entire betrayed victim routine you are adopting is exhausting. I am actively trying to offer you the courtesy of radical honesty, instead of sneaking around behind your back like a coward. There it was, laid bare, the sleek, therapeutic language that profoundly selfish people use to transform a cheap betrayal into an act of psychological enlightenment. Honesty, growth, personal evolution, space, any collection of modern buzzwords that could successfully insulate him from the dirty reality of basic human accountability. He took a step closer to me, lowering his voice into a tone he usually reserved for closing difficult commercial real estate deals. "You are still my legal wife, Vivienne. You still retain full access to this custom home, this lifestyle, and absolute financial security. I am not abandoning our life. I am simply asking you to adapt to its expansion. Adapt. As if I were merely an outdated piece of operating software that required a routine patch to remain functional." I looked around the kitchen we had designed together 15 years ago, back when we couldn't afford a general contractor. The specific Calcutta marble countertops I had spent weeks sourcing, the hand-blown glass pendant lights I had carefully wired into the junction box while 6 months pregnant with Chloe, the exact height of the baseboards I had painted on my knees. Every square inch of that structure bore the physical imprint of my labor, my design expertise, and my invisible sacrifices. Yet, Sterling spoke of our life as though he had single-handedly conjured it out of nothing through the sheer force of his financial will. After he went upstairs to pack that night, I stayed in the darkened kitchen for nearly an hour, listening to the house settle. The massive stainless refrigerator hummed its monotonous song against the drywall, and the outdoor pool lights reflected a trembling, distorted blue pattern against the glass of the patio doors. Somewhere 3 blocks over, a dog barked into the warm, dry desert air. My eyes drifted to the stone fireplace in the adjoining room, where our formal wedding portrait hung under a dedicated picture light. We looked so impossibly young in that gold frame, Sterling's hand resting proudly against my hip, my face illuminated by the kind of total trust that only belongs to young brides who believe love is an automatic shield against becoming strangers. I walked to the wall, reached up, and lifted the heavy frame off its iron hook. I didn't do it out of blinding rage, not yet. I did it because I finally understood something devastating. The marriage preserved in that glass no longer existed. Sterling left on Tuesday morning, carrying 2 custom leather suitcases, his face shielded by expensive polarized sunglasses, radiating the unshakable confidence of a man who believes the world will always pause its rotation until he decides to return. Alana sat in the passenger seat of his black Range Rover, her white linen trousers perfectly pressed, one freshly manicured hand resting possessively over his forearm as he shifted the vehicle into reverse. Neither of them looked back at the front porch where I stood, but Chloe did. My daughter stood half a step behind me, wrapped in an oversized, faded Arizona State sweatshirt despite the morning heat. Her arms locked tightly across her chest. She watched her father's luxury vehicle clear the lip of the driveway with an expression that was far too detached and ancient for a 16-year-old girl. She did not wave. The SUV rounded the corner of the boulevard, the exhaust note fading into the morning traffic, and the silence that rushed into the vacuum felt entirely unnatural, like the house itself had suddenly run out of oxygen. For the first 48 hours, I moved through the empty rooms with a mechanical, ghostly detachment, completely unable to sustain focus long enough to complete a single domestic task. I stacked the plates into the dishwasher and forgot to add the detergent. I reheated the same mug of black coffee 3 separate times until the afternoon sun hit the counter, realizing I had never taken a single sip. At night, I lay perfectly flat on my side of the mattress, staring at the white blades of the ceiling fan, rotating in the dark, my brain relentlessly looping the tape of the backyard barbecue. Sterling's voice, the performative pitch of his laughter, the agonizing humiliation of standing there while our friends adjusted their eyes to avoid witnessing my shame. Humiliation is a profoundly physical experience. It doesn't remain in the mind, but rather settles into the marrow of your bones, the pit of your stomach, and the surface of your skin. What cut deepest was not even the physical infidelity, but the absolute, radiant certainty on Sterling's face when he announced it. He possessed a foundational confidence that I would tolerate any degree of emotional erasure rather than risk losing the material comfort of the life we had engineered. 3 days into his trip, the public digital archive of his romance began to surface. Acquaintances from our social circle began text-forwarding screenshots of Alana's social media posts, delivering them with that awkward, performative sympathy that people use when they want to be the first to witness a wreck. There Sterling stood, shirtless against the brilliant blue horizon of a Mykonos infinity pool, raising a sweating glass of vintage champagne, while Alana pressed her cheek against his chest, both of them radiating the distinct, smug satisfaction of people who confuse being envied with being respected. The typed caption beneath the image read, "Life truly begins the moment you stop apologizing for your own happiness." I stared at the high-resolution pixels for several long seconds, and then a genuine laugh escaped my lips. It wasn't because I found the situation humorous, but because there is something profoundly predictable about a middle-aged man abandoning his family and believing he is participating in a radical romantic revolution when he is actually executing the most unoriginal cliché in the American playbook. Chloe walked into the kitchen while the screen was still illuminated in my hand, her bare feet making no sound on the tile. "Are you holding up okay?" she asked quietly, her eyes tracking the phone. I locked the display and slid it into my pocket. "I am going to be entirely fine," I told her, reaching for a water glass. She opened the refrigerator, pulled out a carton of juice, and hesitated before looking back at me across the island. "You know what strikes me as completely bizarre?" she said, her voice steady. "Dad is posting everything online like he just won some kind of trophy." The observation startled me because it was so entirely accurate. Sterling was behaving as though our marriage had been a prison sentence he had successfully broken out of, as if his proximity to a younger woman had validated his entire existence. Men of his particular composition always confuse temporary attention with a spiritual rebirth. Chloe leaned against the counter, her eyes dark and serious. "But honestly, Mom, he just looks incredibly pathetic." I looked at my daughter, truly studying her face in the morning light. Somewhere between her advanced placement courses, her weekend driving lessons, and her stacks of college applications, she had quietly developed a level of psychological clarity that I had completely failed to notice. "I don't want you to carry hatred for your father, Chloe," I said carefully, wanting to protect her from my own bitterness. She shrugged her shoulders with a mature indifference. "I don't hate him at all," she replied, setting her glass down. "I just think he fully expected you to fall completely apart without him here." The absolute weight of her words landed with a physical force. That afternoon, for the first time since the Range Rover had cleared the driveway, I walked down the short hallway and turned the brass handle of the home office door. Sterling rarely handled the administrative architecture of his life anymore. Success had made him incredibly lazy regarding invoices, banking records, corporate filings, and tax disclosures. Everything was tossed carelessly into disorganized leather trays and metal filing drawers, while he spent his afternoons at networking lunches and golf outings with Valley developers. At first, my search was restricted to identifying our primary liquid bank accounts. But as I began spreading the statements across the wide desk, distinct structural patterns began to emerge. There were massive luxury hotel bills processed directly through the construction firm's operating account, international flights for Alana categorized as essential corporate marketing travel, high-end jewelry purchases from boutiques in Scottsdale Quarter listed under client entertainment expenses. Thousands upon thousands of dollars had been quietly, systematically siphoned through our shared corporate entities to fund his romance. I sat in that leather chair for nearly 3 hours, methodically sorting the documents into color-coded stacks, while something fundamental inside my chest changed shape. It wasn't a flare of rage, but rather a cold, crystalline clarity. The following morning, I drove down to the financial district of Phoenix to meet with Eleanor Vance Gideon, a family law attorney whose reputation among the city's executive circles was defined by an absolute, unblinking precision. Her office was a minimalist space of cold glass walls and soaring views of the desert mountains. Eleanor Vance Gideon sat entirely motionless in her sharp navy suit, her silver blonde bob perfectly catching the stark afternoon light, her calm eyes reflecting decades of marital battlefields. She listened to my narrative without a single interruption, her manicured fingers folded neatly over a yellow legal pad. When I finally finished presenting the stack of corporate ledgers, she slid several highlighted banking statements across the desk toward me. "First," she said, her voice a calm, rhythmic drone, "your husband is not nearly as intelligent as his net worth has led him to believe." I blinked, clearing my throat. "These specific extramarital extractions from your corporate accounts are legally significant," she continued, tapping the page with a silver pen. "And based on the historical incorporation records you provided, the foundational liquidity for his construction firm originated entirely from your mother's inheritance." "That was nearly a decade ago," I murmured. "Does that still carry weight?" "Documentation always carries weight, Vivian." For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sensation stirring beneath my ribs. It wasn't a sudden burst of hope, but rather a cold sense of forward momentum. Eleanor leaned back into her leather executive chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Men of your husband's psychological profile almost always make the exact same strategic miscalculation," she said, her voice dropping into a lower register. "They genuinely believe the spouse who maintains the quiet stability of their existence possesses no real power simply because that labor isn't flashy or transactional." I looked down at the highlighted lines of text silently, the numbers blurring for a second. "He genuinely believes he built our entire life through his own singular willpower," I admitted. "No," Eleanor corrected gently, her hand coming down flat against the paper. "He thinks you will never stop protecting him from the consequences of his own behavior." The sentence lodged itself deep inside my consciousness, because she had identified the exact dynamic that had governed my life for nearly 2 decades. Every single year of our marriage, I had functioned as the emotional custodian of Sterling's existence. I swept up the wreckage of his volatile temper after he yelled at site managers. I managed the holiday calendars, the family obligations, the tax preparations, the sudden property repairs, and the intricate rhythms of Chloe's school schedules. I absorbed the background radiation of his stress so completely and seamlessly that eventually he stopped perceiving the labor at all. Invisible labor only remains invisible until the woman doing it decides to fold her arms and step away from the machine. Over the next 2 weeks, a new, rigid structure emerged in my daily routine. I re-established contact with the residential developers from my old interior design career and discovered, to my immense surprise, that the market had not forgotten my name. An old design colleague contacted me out of the blue, asking if I would be willing to consult on a high-end boutique hotel renovation nestled against the red rocks of Sedona. Each professional conversation felt like recovering fragmented, buried pieces of a woman I had abandoned years ago to become the background singer in Sterling's rock and roll show. Meanwhile, my husband barely initiated contact from Europe, sending only sporadic, late-night texts that arrived while the Arizona sun was setting. "Having an incredible time in Mykonos," one message read. "You should really learn to relax and explore your options more." Or, later that week, "Hope Chloe is behaving herself." Never once did he ask how I was sleeping, how the house was running, or how I was processing the sudden public dismantling of our family. One evening, Chloe and I ordered spicy Thai food and sat on the back patio, while the summer desert heat rolled across the valley in slow, oppressive waves, the sky burning a brilliant, toxic orange behind the distant mountains. "You seem completely different lately, Mom," she said suddenly, watching me over her plate. I glanced up, smiling faintly. "Different good? Or different terrifying?" "A little bit of both," she admitted, her eyes crinkling at the corners. I set my chopsticks down against the porcelain. Maybe I am just entirely finished with being underestimated by people who benefit from my silence. Chloe looked down at her food, her expression turning deeply reflective before she spoke again. You know, she said carefully, Dad always acted as though you needed his success far more than he ever needed your presence. The statement settled heavily into the warm air between us, because the most devastating realization was that, for many years, I had internalized that exact lie. That night, after Chloe went upstairs to study, I walked into the main living room carrying a large, heavy cardboard box. Methodically, without a single tear or a moment of hesitation, I began stripping the physical presence of Sterling Vance from the common spaces of our home. I removed the silver-framed vacation photos, the golf trophies he insisted on displaying, the carefully curated artifacts of a lifestyle designed to broadcast permanence to the outside world. By midnight, the living room felt wider, colder, and entirely altered. There was a single, prominent empty space directly above the stone fireplace where our formal wedding portrait had hung for 17 long years. The pale, unfaded rectangle of paint remained stubbornly visible beneath the recessed halogen lighting, looking precisely like a ghost that refused to fully dissolve into the drywall. I stood there in the dark, staring at that blank space for a long time, and then, completely unexpectedly, a genuine smile touched my lips. It wasn't because the grief had vanished, but because I finally recognized the truth of what Sterling had done. He believed he had left me entirely powerless by stepping out of our marriage. What he had actually done was leave me alone in the quiet, long enough to remember exactly who I was, before I dedicated my intellect to building an empire around his ego. By the third week of his Mediterranean vacation, the neighborhood camouflage had completely melted away. Infidelity requires absolute secrecy to maintain its charm, but humiliation relies entirely on a public performance. Sterling had made our domestic arrangements a matter of public record at the barbecue, which meant our social circle began interacting with me with that exaggerated, walking on eggshells kindness that people reserve for terminal patients. Women at the local market touched my forearm a little too softly during conversation. Neighbors spoke to me in hushed, reverent tones across the garden fences. Pity exhausted my spirit far quicker than anger ever could, so I simply stopped hiding inside the house. Every morning at dawn, I drove 40 minutes north into Sedona to oversee the boutique hotel project. The property sat directly against the towering sandstone cliffs, glowing like hammered copper under the morning sun, and for the first time in an eternity, my days belonged to an objective greater than managing my husband's comfort. I argued with masonry contractors about tile finishes, reviewed textile weights in the temporary design trailer, and laughed over takeout lunches with young architects who called me ma'am with terrifying respect. Slowly, the marrow in my bones began to harden again. It was during a late afternoon fabric review that I met Julian Thorne, the lead architect attached to the hotel renovation. He was 48, divorced, and carried himself with the quiet, unforced composure that only belongs to men who have entirely finished trying to impress the room. He wore no flashy watches, initiated no competitive conversations, and possessed an innate capacity to listen to a sentence until it was fully completed before formulating a response. The first time he brought a coffee to my drafting table, he quietly asked if I preferred oat milk, instead of assuming he already knew my mind. I had entirely forgotten how intoxicating basic human respect could feel. Nothing inappropriate transpired between us. We were simply two midlife professionals who took solace in each other's competence. Yet, I noticed how quickly the hotel staff began projecting a romantic narrative onto our long hours in the design trailer. The world loves a reinvention story, where a betrayed woman immediately finds her validation in the arms of a wiser, kinder man. But my true transformation had absolutely nothing to do with finding a new partner. It had everything to do with watching my lingering sorrow finally calcify into absolute self-respect. Meanwhile, Sterling continued broadcasting his midlife crisis across the digital landscape like a teenager experiencing unsupervised freedom for the very first time. Capri, Positano, Amalfi, an endless, exhausting stream of high-definition photographs featuring candlelit cliffside dinners, yacht excursions, and matching designer shopping bags. Alana posted a short video of them clinking crystal glasses on a speedboat, Sterling grinning into the lens with the rigid, over-caffeinated overconfidence of a man desperately trying to convince his own subconscious that he was happy. Sometimes, late at night in the quiet house, I would zoom in on those images. I didn't do it because I missed his touch. I did it because I recognized something profoundly tragic in the lines of his face. Sterling looked completely depleted, not physically, but spiritually. It was the specific, haunting exhaustion that comes from having to perform happiness for an audience, because you are entirely incapable of experiencing it in isolation. People always imagine revenge as a grand act of physical or verbal destruction. They picture screaming arguments through open windows, shattered glass on driveways, or a dramatic public exposure. But real, devastating revenge, I was beginning to understand, is an exercise in absolute indifference. It is the act of quietly reclaiming the exact pieces of your identity that someone else tried to convince you were too old, too boring, or too dependent to survive without. 3 days before Sterling's scheduled flight back to Phoenix, Eleanor Vance Gideon called me into her office and calmly slid a manila folder across the polished desk. "I have successfully finalized the temporary residential property agreement," she stated, her face completely unreadable. Because Sterling had funneled marital assets into his vacation with such reckless disregard for accounting ethics, and because the down payment of our home was tied directly to my mother's inheritance, Eleanor had established total leverage before the formal divorce filings were even served. The house was now legally under my sole residential jurisdiction during the separation. "He is going to completely lose his mind when he reads this," I murmured, tracing the legal seal. Eleanor's expression remained perfectly serene. "No, Vivienne," she corrected softly. "He is simply going to lose the long-standing illusion that his actions do not carry real-world consequences." There was an immense, comforting beauty in her cold legal precision. On my drive back to Scottsdale, the Arizona sun stretched across the valley like liquid gold, and for the first time in 17 years, I rolled the windows completely down, allowing the hot desert air to flood the cabin while the music played. I realized then that I no longer desired his destruction. A few weeks prior, I had fantasized about breaking his public persona, but deeper than rage was a quiet, lethal desire for absolute freedom. That evening, Chloe helped me repaint the living room. We spent 5 hours transforming the old, heavy beige walls into a crisp, radiant white that caught every ray of natural light. At one point, she climbed down the ladder, looking at the blank wall over the fireplace. "Are we erasing him, Mom?" she asked quietly. I set my roller down carefully, looking at her. "No, sweetheart. We are simply making room for ourselves again." If you have ever found yourself standing in a room you helped build, realizing you had to change the entire space just to breathe, you are not alone. Please consider subscribing to the channel to support these stories, and leave a comment below about the exact moment you realized a relationship was truly over, or when you finally stopped waiting for someone to apologize for the damage they caused. 2 days later, the house bore no resemblance to the structure Sterling had left behind. I had removed the heavy, dark leather furniture and replaced it with clean lines, light linen fabrics, and open spaces. The very air inside the home felt lighter, as though 2 decades of unsaid grievances had finally evaporated into the desert sky. Then came the final piece. I stood before the empty space above the fireplace holding a massive framed photograph that had been delivered to the house that afternoon. It wasn't a wedding portrait. The image had been captured accidentally during a project dinner in Sedona. Julian and I were standing outside beneath a canopy of small white lights, while the sunset burned a deep red across the cliffs behind us. We were both laughing completely unreservedly at something happening off camera, my face looking alive and vibrant in a way I hadn't seen since my 20s. Directly beneath that frame, I mounted a second, smaller frame containing the clean, certified copy of the temporary property agreement. Simple, elegant, and entirely final. The late afternoon sun began its slow descent over Scottsdale, casting long, geometric shadows of gold and amber across the newly lightened hardwood floor. I stood by the kitchen island, methodically slicing fresh lemons for a pitcher of iced tea, listening to the absolute, uninterrupted stillness of the house. Then, Precisely at 4:42 p.m., the heavy motorized groan of the garage door echoed through the foundation of the villa. My chest tightened automatically with a deep, systemic instinct that 17 years of marriage ruthlessly wire into your nervous system. Your body retains the rhythm of a man's arrival long after your intellect has completely severed his access to your respect. I heard his footsteps, the heavy, entitlement-driven stride of a man who firmly believes he is returning to a piece of property he owns by right of conquest. Sterling entered through the mudroom door, trailing the distinct, artificial scent of expensive airport cologne, high-end sunscreen, and the stale air of a first-class cabin. He looked deeply tanned, his silver-flecked hair cut precisely, carrying himself with the overly relaxed aura of a celebrity returning from a high-profile rehabilitation stint. He tossed his keys onto the quartz island with a sharp clatter. "Well," he said, his voice dripping with casual indifference as he scanned the room. "You still alive in here?" I remained completely silent, moving the knife smoothly through the rind of the final lemon. Sterling stopped mid-stride, his brow furrowing, as the subtle, structural differences of the kitchen began to register in his consciousness. The lack of familiar clutter, the disappearance of his preferred heavy cedarwood candles, the crisp scent of citrus, and the sheer emotional lightness of the space seemed to disorient him. "Where is Chloe?" he demanded, his voice dropping a fraction of an inch. "She is at a weekend university preparation retreat," I answered evenly, wiping my hands on a fresh linen towel. "She will be returning on Sunday afternoon." Sterling gave a distracted nod, rolling his designer leather suitcase behind him as he stepped fully into the adjoining living room. Then, he froze. It wasn't a casual pause, but a total, absolute cessation of physical movement, his knuckles turning white where they gripped the luggage handle. I watched from the kitchen threshold as the entire architecture of his public confidence collapsed inward. His eyes were locked onto the white expanse of drywall above the fireplace, where our wedding portrait had previously resided for nearly 2 decades. Now, illuminated perfectly beneath the recessed halogen lights, hung the massive photograph of Julian and me, laughing against the fiery Sedona sunset, our joy looking entirely unforced and absolute. And mounted directly beneath it, positioned like a terminal judgment, was the silent prop of the legal agreement, my name clearly visible on the line, designating sole residential authority. For several agonizing seconds, the room remained entirely hollowed out by silence. Men of Sterling's psychological makeup are fueled by the anticipation of emotional hysterics. They require tears, screaming accusations, and desperate pleas, because those reactions validate their sense of supreme importance in your life. My absolute stillness left him completely unanchored. "What in the hell is this supposed to mean, Vivienne?" he asked, his voice sounding thin, dry, and stripped of its usual corporate resonance. I walked slowly into the space, stopping a few feet away from his luggage. "It is an image of a very successful design collaboration," I replied, my tone perfectly level. "I can see that," he snapped, his eyes darting frantically between the photograph and the legal document mounted beneath it. "Who is the man standing beside you in my living room?" "His name is Julian Thorne," I said. Sterling let out a sharp, ugly laugh that contained no genuine humor whatsoever, only the defensive reflex of a wounded ego. "You are absolutely unbelievable, Vivienne. You spend a month pretending to be devastated by a modern marital conversation, and the moment my back is turned, you hang pictures of another man inside my house." I looked at him, feeling a sudden, profound wave of detachment wash over me. "This is no longer your house, Sterling," I stated, gesturing mildly toward the lower frame. "You should read the certified paperwork before you continue speaking." He dropped his suitcase handle, stepped forward aggressively, and snatched the legal frame off the wall, his eyes scanning the dense, typewritten paragraphs, while the remaining color slowly drained from his face. "What kind of a stunt is this?" he stammered. "It is a temporary residential order issued by the family court," I explained calmly. "It grants me exclusive use of this property during our separation proceedings." "You filed for a divorce?" "Yes, I did." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sterling stared at me as if truly seeing me for the first time in 10 years, his mind visibly calculating the reality that the world had continued spinning while he was playing the wealthy tourist in Greece. When exactly were you planning to disclose this little betrayal to me? He demanded, throwing the frame face up onto the light linen sofa. You seemed entirely occupied with your digital broadcast, I told him. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at the desert photograph. This entire ambush is because of him, isn't it? You're sleeping with some local architect. The old version of me would have cried, pleaded, and offered a desperate defense of my integrity. But something fundamental had shifted during those quiet weeks alone. No, Sterling, I am not. He blinked, completely thrown off his script. What? Julian is a respected professional colleague and a reliable friend, I said, tilting my head. It is a very interesting choice of words you are using today. You know exactly what I mean, he growled, his jaw tightening until the muscle ticked. No, I replied smoothly. I don't think you do at all. You are actively trying to humiliate me in my own home, he said, his voice rising as he attempted to regain command of the conversation. Humiliation, I repeated, the word sounding light and insignificant in the room. That is a fascinating concept coming from a man who announced his extramarital arrangements at a neighborhood barbecue in front of our friends and our teenage daughter. That was entirely different, Sterling countered, his chest heaving. Why? Because I possessed the courage to be honest with you. The towering hypocrisy of his statement landed so heavily in the room that even he seemed to recoil slightly from the sound of his own words. I crossed my arms slowly. You told me this was an open marriage, Sterling. You explicitly commanded me to adapt to your new freedom. His eyes narrowed into slits. That is absolutely not the same thing, and you know it. There it was at last. The ugly, unvarnished truth beneath all his therapeutic language about personal evolution and growth. Sterling never wanted an equal partnership of freedom. He wanted exclusive permission. He wanted the license to betray his family without facing a single real-world consequence, maintaining a stable domestic base that I built while he explored his appetites. He looked around the bright, open room again, but this time his expression carried something much deeper than anger. It was fear. For the first time in 17 years, he understood that I was no longer an adversary to be managed or a dependent to be pacified. I was simply a woman who had already moved on without him. You really executed all of this while I was across the world? He murmured, his voice losing its edge. Yes, I said. And you didn't even bother to call me. The statement revealed far more of his internal weakness than he ever intended to show. He genuinely believed I would spend his month away weeping, chasing him via text, and begging for a reconciliation while he paraded another woman across Europe. I held his gaze without a single blink. You already left this house, Sterling. His face hardened. No, I went on a scheduled vacation. No, I repeated, my voice dropping into a whisper. You left your family long before you ever arrived at the airport. For a split second, a crack appeared in his defensive mask, revealing a flash of hollow, disoriented recognition. Then, a floorboard creaked softly on the landing above. Sterling glanced toward the staircase just as Chloe slowly descended the steps, her heavy school backpack slung over one shoulder. She had returned early with a classmate's parents, standing midway down the stairs with a quiet, ancient disappointment that hit him harder than any legal brief. Hey there, Chloe, Sterling said, his voice cracking slightly as he took a step toward her. My daughter stopped on the landing, her eyes moving deliberately from the photograph of the desert to the discarded legal papers on the sofa, and finally to her father's face. Dad, did you really think Mom would just sit here forever while you ran around Europe with your girlfriend? Sterling opened his mouth to formulate a response, but no sound came out. Chloe shook her head with a slow, devastating finality. You left first, she said simply. She turned, walked back up the stairs, and closed her door, leaving her father standing entirely alone inside the consequences of his arrogance. He looked suddenly older, his expensive vacation attire looking completely ridiculous against the stark white walls of a home that no longer recognized his authority. As we approach the end of this journey, if you have ever had to watch the illusions of a selfish person crumble under the weight of the truth, please take a moment to share this video with someone who might need to hear it. I would love to read your comments below. about what you would say to the person who spent years underestimating your strength, or what you wish you had known about your own power much sooner. Sterling remained near the cold fireplace for several minutes, staring at the empty space where his old life used to live. The house had stopped anticipating his needs, and that realization seemed to wound his pride far deeper than any financial division could. He walked back into the kitchen, shutting the stainless refrigerator door with an unnecessary, violent force. "So that's the final play?" he asked without turning around. "You just decided to dissolve our family while I was gone." I leaned against the counter, completely unbothered by his anger. "No, Sterling. You decided the future of this family the exact moment you demanded I accept your infidelity as a condition of keeping my home. You're completely twisting the narrative," he snapped, turning to face me. "You know what your problem is, Vivian? You always make everything sound so much colder than it actually is." I almost smiled. "You embarrassed me publicly. You emptied corporate funds to finance an international affair. And you are shocked that I have stopped protecting your reputation," I said. For 2 decades, I had been the emotional insulation around his volatility, absorbing the impact of his choices before they could shatter his world. The tragedy was not that he failed to appreciate the machinery of my loyalty. The tragedy was that he had become entirely blind to its existence until it disappeared. He walked over to the patio doors, looking out at the swimming pool shimmering under the indigo desert twilight. "I didn't think you would go this far," he admitted quietly. I didn't think. There it was. The most devastating admission of his life, delivered too late to salvage a single fragment of what he had thrown away. He hadn't thought about the cost, the consequences, or the woman who had signed away her mother's $70,000 inheritance to give him a future. He had simply assumed his immunity was permanent. Our separation unfolded over the following months with remarkably little public drama. The neighbors waited for explosive confrontations, but real strength is entirely silent. Sterling moved into a high-priced downtown loft, but the cold mathematics of divorce quickly dissolved the glamour of his new freedom. Corporate accounts were placed under strict forensic auditing, and the unnecessary luxury spending dried up instantly. Alana Brooks vanished from his orbit the exact moment the permanence of a legal battle replaced the excitement of an international vacation. Nearly a year later, Sterling came by the house to retrieve a box of historical tax documents from the garage. His hair was completely gray now, his posture quieter, the aggressive overconfidence completely tempered by a heavy dose of reality. Before leaving, he paused in the living room. The photograph of Julian and me had been moved to my design studio. In its place hung a beautiful, candid picture of Chloe and me, standing barefoot on a California beach, laughing into a salty wind. He studied it for several seconds before looking at me. "You seem genuinely happy, Vivian," he murmured. And for the first time in my life, the answer required no effort. "I am," I said. I watched him walk down the driveway, his figure disappearing into the quiet Scottsdale afternoon. I turned the deadbolt, locking the front door from the inside, and stood completely still in the peaceful, sunlit silence of a house that finally felt like my own home.